At 0916, Ellie Ror's A-10C Thunderbolt II cut a slow arc over the Mojave Rim, its matte gray fuselage glinting in fragments beneath the desert sun. She flew just under 10,000 feet, not low enough to draw attention, but low enough to feel the contours of the terrain. The heat shimmer blurred ridgelines into soft waves, and the old jet moved through it like something returning to where it had once belonged. Her hands, gloved and steady, hovered lightly over the HOTAS. She didn't grip hard. She didn't need to. Every vibration through the stick, every whine in the throttle's resistance, spoke in a language she'd spent years learning by hand. The aircraft had been a rusted shell when she first saw it. 2 years in a hangar near Yuma, a year of chasing parts, and nearly a full 4th year testing subsystems and ceiling panels with her own torque wrench. The Warthog flew now because she had made it fly again. Ellie wore no insignia, no rank, just a plain green flight suit, worn from years of mechanics' labor. A faded patch near her left wrist showed the remnants of a call sign no longer used. She wasn't flying for points or training hours. She was flying for memory, and the air was clear. Somewhere ahead, terrain rose in slow terraces. The old sectional chart clipped to her kneeboard outlined the MOA's boundary, in red. She had checked it twice that morning. She thought she was skirting its edge. She thought wrong. At 0928, the radar screen at Edwards Range lit up. A slow-moving contact had breached the southeast perimeter of Alpha Grid 6, which had been closed off since 0600 for a live-fire range drill involving drone targets and F-16C Block 50 sorties. The contact wasn't squawking a valid Mode 3. There was no assigned squawk code, no filed flight plan, and no MIL-to-SIV integration flag. Just a dot crawling west at 240 knots IAS, transponder silent. Inside the tower, the tech on duty tapped twice on the glass, signaling a supervisor. The screen confirmed altitude, speed, and aircraft class. Military legacy airframe. Probably civilian mod. Possibly stolen. No way it was part of the day's operations. Ellie's headset crackled at 0930. The voice that came through was clipped, neutral, all consonants. Unidentified aircraft, you are entering restricted military airspace. Turn heading 200 immediately. Acknowledge on this frequency. She blinked into the glare, leaned slightly left, and reached for the rudder with the ball of her boot. The desert below had shifted without her noticing. She had drifted over the edge of the MOA's outer range, lured by the slow rise of the ridgeline ahead. November 8209er14. I'm correcting course now. Requesting exit vector on 220. There was a pause. Then a second voice. Flatter. Negative. Hold current position. Prepare for escort to range perimeter. Ellie didn't speak again. She adjusted her heading by 3 degrees and eased her left wing down. The A-10 gave a low grunt through the fuselage, turbines winding ever so slightly to maintain trim. Nothing abrupt. She kept eyes forward and systems green. At 0933, 2 F-16C Fighting Falcons climbed into her airspace from the northeast, painted in standard gray camo with visible training pods underwing. They moved fast and coordinated. One settled on her 2 o'clock. The other rolled behind at 5 o'clock high. They maintained 500 feet of lateral spread, tight enough to assert control, wide enough to avoid being mistaken for aggression. Lead to range, visual on target. Old airframe. Looks like an A-10, possibly civilian rebuild. Copy lead. Low-risk incursion. Procedural escort. Maintain non-lethal posture. The lead pilot switched channels. Ma'am, are you flying that thing on purpose? Or is this a joyride gone wrong? Ellie said nothing. Her eyes stayed on the horizon. Her RPMs held just under 70%. She made no attempt to break formation. No movement toward transponder override. The pilot's voice returned, younger this time. She doesn't sound military. Probably an old tech who restored a warbird for air shows. The jets didn't break formation. The tone had shifted, but the posture remained tight. Inside Ellie's cockpit, the analog dials read steady. The artificial horizon was centered. Her fuel burn ticked low and efficient. She didn't look at the F-16s. She flew the line, like she always had. At 0938, her IFF panel blinked once, an old amber LED. Half-burned, once labeled in marker, now barely readable, flickered to life. Ellie didn't notice. She had never powered that system. It was supposed to be disconnected, but the aircraft had recognized something. It had registered the radar signature of the range, the encrypted interrogations from the F-16s, and the legacy frequency bounce from the MOA grid. Protocol detection complete. The A-10's backup transponder pinged a 4-digit code last used in 1996. No name, no call sign, just the tail number and a legacy signature tag buried in one of its onboard. Microcontrollers. In the tower, the radar screen shifted. A new overlay in blue. One of the supervisors leaned forward, eyebrows tightening. "What's this code?" The younger tech squinted. The ID came from the aircraft's internal ping. Verified checksum, not spoofed. The file tag read RO status, Ghost Legacy. By 0941, flight operations had logged the incident as non-combatant intercept, but escalated it to command for historical verification. The F-16s received no new orders. They flew their formation in silence. Ellie reached up and adjusted the canopy shade. The light had changed, not in color, in feeling. She didn't know what her aircraft had just told the system. She didn't know what the system had remembered. She just kept flying. At 0942, Ellie Ror adjusted her trim by a half degree. The A-10C Thunderbolt II eased into smoother air, its old frame sighing gently against the crosswinds. Outside her canopy, the desert unfolded into a wash of canyons and scrub lines. The F-16s stayed where they were, tight formation, watching, not quite hostile, not quite convinced. She said nothing. Her hands rested on the stick and throttle. Movement, minimal. The sarcasm from the fighter pilots earlier hadn't bothered her. She'd heard worse in hangars and war zones. What mattered was that the jet was flying right. The turbines held steady. The fuel feed was smooth. And the aircraft still responded to her touch like it remembered who she was. The silence grew heavier. One of the intercept pilots spoke again. Tone casual but forced. "This bird's patched up to hell. You think she even knows she's in a hot zone?" The other replied with a clipped laugh. "Looks like someone's personal museum project. I wouldn't trust those rivets at 3 Gs. Still, Ellie offered nothing. Her attitude stayed flat. Nose level. Throttle holding a conservative power curve. The A-10's analog gauges remained green. She didn't need to push the aircraft. She needed it to endure. At 0946, something shifted. In the radar control tower at Edwards, the junior technician monitoring Grid 6 squinted at a blinking square on the secondary scope. A new signal was overlaying the existing contact. Not transponder mode 3, not civilian ADS-B. This one was internal. Legacy coded. Mode 4F. The console pinged twice in low tone. The signal carried an embedded identifier, 4 numerals, followed by a protocol tag marked RO. Not recent. The system date on the handshake verification was set to 1997, but the signal was real. It wasn't an echo or spoof. It was a valid military-encoded response generated by onboard IFF hardware. The technician flagged a supervisor. "Sir, we've got a ghost ping on the A-10. It just ID'd itself on a legacy RO tag. I'm pulling archive cross-check now." The supervisor leaned over, frowning. "That system's deprecated. We scrubbed those codes out years ago. It just fired from inside the transponder, and it's authenticated." Hardware level, the room grew quiet. The system returned full confirmation by 0949. Tail number 820914. Legacy RO signature. Status dormant protocol activation. Original pilot ID redacted. Mission origin Canyon hold. Archive status sealed by command directive. No one in the tower spoke for several seconds. Then one of the older radar leads, gray at the temple and slow to rise, took a closer look at the terminal. He tapped the touchscreen twice, clearing the filter view. When the aircraft's tag reappeared in full telemetry overlay, his breath caught. "That number's not random. It's real." The staffer beside him tilted his head. "What is it?" The older man stared at the monitor. The aircraft's ID had stopped blinking. It was holding in system, confirmed, treated as known. "That's the plane from Canyon Hold." The words hung in the air. One of the interns looked up from her screen. "Is that like a training file?" The supervisor shook his head. It was a classified rescue op. No public version, no video, just doctrine. Most people thought it was exaggerated. Some thought it was fake. The tag on the monitor remained solid. Status confirmed aircraft ID. Protocol RO reactivated. Required response verify and monitor. No engagement. At 0952, the tower controller placed a call to command operations. Bypassing routine chain of command. "Sir, we have an unauthorized aircraft in MOA airspace transmitting a dormant RO tag. Tail number 820914. IFF authenticated. We need a review of legacy access codes." On the other end, there was a pause. Then a voice, older, calm, and surprised. "Say that tail number again." 820914. Repeat. "The aircraft has reactivated protocol RO. Affirm Mode 4 handshake. System green lit it as legacy authorized. It's responding to tactical grid inputs and range beacons. Not requesting access, it's already inside. Command requested full visual ID. A separate team pulled up satellite optics and began compiling a file. The aircraft's paint scheme was desert faded. Patch seams visible, but flightworthy. The engine nacelles were reinforced with panel welds. No munitions, no external stores, just fuel pods and nav beacons. It had no markings besides the stenciled tail number on both sides. It was flying within 50 feet of projected formation margin. And it was flying calm. Back in the air, the F-16 pilots had gone quiet. One of them moved slightly closer to the A-10, adjusting his altitude to get a look at the cockpit. Through the glare, he could just make out a single figure, helmeted, still, not panicked, not aggressive. His tone over the comms had changed. Range, this is interceptor lead. Confirmed tail number on contact aircraft. Visual reads as 820914. Is that correct? The reply came back 2 seconds later. Confirmed. Tail matches legacy protocol RO. All units maintain visual formation. Do not deviate. Further instructions inbound. The second pilot muttered under his breath. What the hell is RO? The lead didn't answer. His hand tightened slightly on the throttle. It's canyon hold. That's the Warthog they used. The one that pulled 6 bodies out of a dead zone. That was a story. Man, it's not in the public records. It's not public because it wasn't for PR. It was real. 1 aircraft, 1 pilot. Mission parameters never declassified. At 09:57, Colonel Ava Hayes arrived in the tower at Edwards. She wore her uniform pressed, not ceremonial. Her expression changed the moment she saw the screen. She didn't need to be briefed. She had been on the ground 27 years ago when that tail number had come through. The canyon, silent and low, no backup, no guarantee. She leaned in. Is the pilot ID confirmed? The tech replied quickly. The transponder lists Ellie Ror, civilian, registered aircraft owner. No active military orders, but the system registered her as legacy personnel under protocol RO. Hayes exhaled through her nose. Her voice softened, but didn't waver. John Rohr's daughter. A nod passed between staff who now understood what the rest of the base hadn't caught up to yet. This wasn't a violation. It wasn't even a return. It was something else. At 1000, the Warthog adjusted its bearing by a sliver. The F-16s matched the movement, now flying just wide enough to give it room. Not enough to feel distant. Ellie didn't speak. She didn't gesture. She kept her eyes forward, hands light, aircraft stable. She hadn't come to prove anything. She had come to remember, and the aircraft remembered with her. At 10:01, the watch officer in base command pulled up the full transponder log. His screen blinked once, then filled with a series of identifiers pulled from the Mode 4 activation. It wasn't just the tail number now. The aircraft had paired with a personnel registry. The name listed was Ellie Ror, civilian. No active duty history. No pilot's wings logged in official flight school. But the system matched her with something deeper. Lineage. Associated clearance. Legacy tag. Father Colonel John Rohr. The officer paused, eyes resting on the name like it meant more than the system could explain. He flagged the data and forwarded it with priority protocol. Colonel Hayes received the alert 30 seconds later and stared at the confirmation. She had never forgotten that name. She had heard it once in a canyon with smoke in her lungs and blood down her side. Back then, John Rohr had flown into an impossible valley in the dead space between GPS, overlays and direct line-of-sight comms. No cover, no backup. Just one A-10, a pilot who ignored the rules, and a refusal to leave anyone behind. He had pulled her out without a word. Now his daughter was flying the same airframe, same tail number, and she was here, unarmed, uninvited, but not unknown. Up in the air, the F-16s were silent. The younger wingman finally spoke, unsure. She's holding altitude to within 20 feet. Consistent vectors, no jitters. That's not a restoration pilot. That's someone who's lived in that cockpit. The lead squinted across the sky, watching the A-10 shift slightly with the wind, then correct itself as if by instinct. The movement was smooth, purposeful. No hunting for trim. No delay in countering updrafts. I thought this was a museum ride. Look at the way she banks. That's no hobby pass. The air around them had gone quiet, as if waiting. The routine calls that usually peppered the comms were gone. No one joked now. The tone had shifted. They weren't escorting a mistake anymore. They were flying next to something older than both of them. Something known. At 10:04, a staffer in operations pulled up the old mission archive. Redacted. Dated. But the core record stood. Protocol Canyon hold. Result 6 recovered. Pilot Colonel John Rohr. Aircraft A-10C. Tail 820914. Status mission success. Aircraft retired. Pilot withdrew from active flight duty 6 months later. No interviews. No commendation ceremony. Colonel Hayes stepped beside the screen. He didn't want his name remembered, she said. Just wanted the plane fixed if it ever broke. The staffer nodded, not quite knowing what to say. In the sky. Ellie made no show of anything. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't gesture. She flew as if she belonged. The Warthog moved with a kind of mutual understanding, not like it had been pulled from a hangar, but like it had been waiting for her. The lead F-16 pilot glanced once more at the markings on her fuselage. He saw the tail number again, 820914. It no longer looked old. It looked earned. He keyed his mic. Range control. Be advised. The pilot in the A-10. Is her last name really Ror? The reply came with a pause. Affirmative. Ellie Ror, civilian pilot, daughter of Colonel John Ror. The pilot didn't respond. He didn't need to. His aircraft adjusted slightly to the right, lining up canopy to canopy for just a second. Through the glare, he caught a glimpse of her face. Calm. Focused. Not surprised. Not proud. Just steady. He pulled back slightly and said nothing else. He understood now, and so did everyone watching. At 10:06, the command floor at Edwards locked into a level of silence that only happened when history stepped back into the room. Screens that moments before tracked active range movements now centered on one signal. The tag for 820914 no longer pulsed red for unauthorized incursion. It showed green, authenticated, legacy protocol RO. Rescue override, activated without manual input. The authentication trace confirmed the handshake sequence. Mode 4. IFF response matched a legacy flight profile embedded deep in archival systems. The protocol hadn't been used in over 2 decades, not because it was outdated, because it was reserved for aircraft that had already proven what no doctrine could test. A lieutenant from comms raised her voice just enough to carry. Sir, the signal wasn't broadcast? It was pinged through onboard passive IFF return. No pilot interaction. System recognized the grid. Colonel Hayes kept her eyes on the telemetry. She didn't speak right away. Behind her, 2 senior officers leaned in toward the display showing cross-verification on legacy tailcodes. One of them folded his arms slowly across his chest, eyes tight. I was in Doctrine Group Charlie back then. We wrote the RO rules after Canyon Hold. Didn't think we'd ever see that flag fly again. The order came without ceremony. Hayes turned toward operations, effective immediately. Suspend intercept, maintain escort in formation only. This aircraft is not to be challenged. A captain near the edge of the room frowned slightly. Ma'am, do we log this as cleared civilian flight? No. Log it as priority historical return. Tail 820914. Confirmed under RO access. Chain of command will handle classification later. The F-16s received the updated flight instruction at 10:08. Their HUDs reflected a change in engagement status. They were no longer intercepting. They were accompanying. In the air. Ellie didn't notice the shift in posture. She didn't need to. The Warthog stayed level beneath her palms, systems humming with a rhythm she had memorized over years of restoration. The desert opened ahead like a corridor she had flown before, even though she hadn't. Not exactly. But the aircraft had. Inside the cockpit, the IFF panel that had triggered the sequence sat quiet again. The amber light no longer blinked. It didn't need to. It had done its job. It had remembered something the world had almost forgotten. At 10:10, the watch officer updated the flight log to reflect the reactivation of RO protocol. A new tag appeared in the system header, historical escort in progress. Clearance not requested, clearance not required. Colonel Hayes spoke again, voice low but direct. Let her fly. She's not in our space. We're in hers. Around the room, no one objected. Not because they feared rank, but because they understood weight. The kind of weight that didn't come with medals or citations, but with lived proof. Ellie Ror wasn't demanding recognition. She was just flying the mission that had always been waiting for her. And in that space above the range, between silence and sound, between now and then, the A-10C flew on. Not with clearance, with memory. At 10:21, the control tower cleared Ellie Ror for final approach. Her A-10C descended over the dry airfield like it belonged there. The F-16s that had once boxed her in now held a wide formation. Not out of caution, but respect. They flew just high enough to be visible and just far enough to give her space. She adjusted her glide slope manually. No autopilot, no voice prompts. Only the rumble of the old airframe easing into descent like it remembered. This runway, too. The tarmac shimmered with heat. Surface temp had climbed past 105 degrees, but the apron was clear. No aircraft blocked her path. No vehicles crossed in front. The runway lights pulsed once in sequence. Not needed in daylight, but intentional. Ground control didn't rush her. She floated in over the numbers and set the gear down clean. Nose wheel touching last, not with drama but with certainty. She taxied at idle. The Warthog's engines growled low but steady. As she passed the northern hangar, base personnel began to emerge. Not many. A few at first, then more. They didn't run. They didn't wave. They came and stood along the edge of the ramp, scattered and quiet. Most had their arms folded or hands at their sides. Some wore utility uniforms, a few still in PT gear. A handful were older. You could tell by the stripes, the posture, the silence. Ellie kept her eyes on the taxi line. Her headset was quiet now. No instructions, no reminders, just the sound of the A-10 moving over familiar pavement. She reached for the engine levers and throttled down one notch at a time. The turbines wound down in response, blades spinning slower, airframe settling. The ground crew gave her the cut signal with calm, practiced precision. She lifted her left hand and acknowledged, then shut both engines off in sequence. The aircraft sighed once more before stillness took hold. The cockpit temperature climbed quickly, but she didn't rush. She unlatched the canopy manually, felt it lift with a hiss, and let the air hit her face. She stood slowly. Her legs ached, not from strain, but from years. Years of fixing, waiting, and finally flying. The ladder dropped with a metallic clack. She descended without fanfare. Her boots touched the concrete like they had landed on something older than a base, like she was stepping onto memory itself. Colonel Ava Hayes stood waiting 10 feet away. Her uniform was standard, but clean. Nothing decorative. No ribbons. No clipboard. Just her. Arms behind her back. Eyes steady. Ellie walked toward her without changing pace. No salutes. No introductions. They had already happened. Decades earlier. In a canyon under rotor wash and smoke. Hayes spoke first. I saw that tail number once. Thought no one would ever fly it again. Ellie nodded once. I rebuilt it. Started with the left nacelle. Took me 4 years. He taught you that. He taught me not to quit on something just because other people forgot how to fix it. Behind them, the F-16s taxied in slow arcs toward the southern pad. One of the pilots shut down and climbed out. He didn't approach. He just watched. His helmet under one arm, gloves still on. The gathered personnel had grown to over 40 now. Still quiet. Still not moving closer. One man, older, with a command patch faded at the edges, stepped forward and touched the A-10's fuselage with the back of his fingers. He said nothing, just looked at the tail number, nodded, and stepped back. Hayes motioned toward the hangar. We've cleared a spot in Bay 3. Maintenance wants to look her over, not because she needs it, because she deserves it. Ellie glanced at the nose gear, still holding firm. She'll hold. She always has. Hayes looked back at the crowd, then at Ellie. There's a briefing later this afternoon. Rescue doctrine refresher for the new class. You should be in there. Ellie raised an eyebrow. What for? Because they've read about canyon hold, but they've never heard from someone who flew that number. Ellie looked around. The sun had shifted slightly west. The ramp shimmered again. A tech walked by, saw the aircraft, paused, and adjusted his stance. Ellie didn't know if she belonged here, but the plane did. That was enough. I'll stay, she said. Hayes offered no smile, only a nod. Then welcome home. Ellie turned back toward the aircraft. The A-10's skin looked dull in the sun, but the lines were clean. There were no ceremonial markings, no gloss, just the number, stenciled in black, 820914. The same it had been the last time it flew into danger. The same it had been when her father flew it out. She didn't touch the airframe again. She didn't have to. It had already said what it came to say, and the base, by its silence, its attention, its absence of applause, had already answered. No headlines, no medals, just continuity and respect. By 1345, the aircraft had been rolled into a maintenance bay under shaded light. The floor crew moved slowly around it, not for safety, but out of respect. The Warthog's skin bore old scars and patch seams. The left nacelle still held faint soot marks from its first rebuild. There was no ceremony, just hands checking panels with care, tools held steady, questions asked in low tones. A senior officer from logistics stepped beside Ellie and offered a folder. Inside was a draft proposal to designate the aircraft as a permanent display. Peace. The plan included a memorial plaque, a sectioned hangar space, and optional visitor access. Ellie scanned the pages in silence. She closed the folder and handed it back. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't debate. She just said quietly and clearly, "It's not meant to sit in a hangar. It was built to fly until it couldn't anymore. And it still can." The officer nodded, not insulted. He understood the difference between honoring a legacy and ending it. Some machines retire with history, others carry it forward. Colonel Hayes met Ellie in the hallway outside the briefing room at 14:10. She didn't ask again about the aircraft. She just said the new class of rescue pilots was about to begin their orientation. She asked if Ellie would sit in. Ellie hesitated for only a moment. Then she said yes. She stepped into the room as the screens flickered on. The cadets were young. Some looked barely out of undergraduate flight school. Their uniforms were neat. Their boots still had stiff seams. They didn't recognize her. Not yet. Hayes introduced her as a guest. Not a veteran. Not a relic. Just someone with insight on real-world mission survivability. Ellie stood off to the side and didn't speak for a while. The instructor started the lesson. It covered basic doctrine, evac prioritization, terrain constraints, the logic of low-speed QS during extraction missions. At 14:24, one of the students raised a question about the Canyon Hold case study. He asked if the pilot in that mission had ever flown again. The room quieted. Ellie didn't answer directly. She stepped forward, eyes on the chart showing the valley layout. The mission wasn't about flying out. It was about going in, knowing no one else would. It was about making the aircraft part of the terrain, letting it hold, letting it carry what couldn't be carried any other way. The students sat straighter. They didn't ask her name. They didn't need to. Ellie stayed through the full hour. She offered technical corrections where needed. She didn't dramatize. She didn't editorialize. She described how weight distribution changes when stretchers are loaded. Through the A-10's center line, she explained what it feels like when wind shear drags against belly armor. She spoke the language of someone who didn't read it in a manual. After the session, a younger pilot approached her and asked if she ever thought about teaching. Full-time. Ellie looked out the window at the tarmac. The sun had dipped behind a low cloud, and the heat shimmer had softened. The A-10 sat outside, parked but not idle. She said quietly, "I'll think about it, because what survives must fly. And sometimes, it teaches first." At 05:47, the alert came in from the field. A recon team had gone silent while moving through Redstone Canyon during a live-fire exercise. Last contact showed them clearing the eastern ridgeline before a rock slide, wiped the trail and buried their comms relay. Satellite confirmed a debris field but couldn't verify movement. No drone feed, no voice, just static and terrain. By 06:15, the command center had exhausted conventional options. Rotorcraft were grounded. The air pressure in the canyon, combined with unpredictable thermals and altitude, made low-hover ops unstable. Chinooks couldn't safely descend. Blackhawks didn't have enough lift margin. The canyon narrowed at the midpoint, and even V-22s risked wall collisions on rotation. Fixed-wing drones lacked payload capacity for survival gear or medkits. Every option was too fast, too light, or too broad. The A-10 could do it. Colonel Hayes reviewed the flight paths, wind vectors, and air density reports. She didn't wait. She walked into the hangar at 06:22 and found Ellie by the intake cowling of her aircraft, already running pre-start checks by hand. No one had called her yet. She didn't need to be told. Hayes gave her the summary: 4-person team, last known at Grid 7B, no visibility, no alternate exit path. Ellie nodded once. "What's the loadout?" 2 crate drops, one with med packs, radio beacons, and cold rations. The second with rope, line anchors, and hydration kits. 47 pounds each, rigged for manual release. Fuel. Full tanks, range exceeds up margin by 70 miles. "You'll have airspace priority." Ellie didn't answer right away. She tightened the last panel bolt with a torque wrench, stepped back, and glanced up at the canopy. The sun hadn't fully broken the ridge. Shadows still clung to the hangar floor. She said, "I'll go." Hayes didn't offer thanks, and she just stepped aside. At 06:41, the A-10 taxied to runway 3. Ground crew cleared her with nods, not words. The same jet that had once flown into another canyon with 6 lives on the line now rolled forward with 4 more waiting. No ceremony, just mission logic. Inside the cockpit, Ellie ran each system check twice. Flaps responded clean. Avionics showed stable temps. Radio beacons were locked to the team's last known coordinates. The drops were strapped into a belly cradle and wired to a manual switch, rigged near her throttle quadrant. She tested the release line. Smooth pull. No delay. At 06:48, she lifted off clean. The Warthog climbed into the low light like it had done this before. Not with pride, with purpose. In the tower, an older air controller murmured, "Canyon hold again?" No one replied. The radio stayed quiet as she turned east. Ellie flew just beneath cloudline, speed trimmed to 190 knots. She didn't oversteer. She didn't ask for updates. She just flew toward the ridgeline, into the same kind of terrain where her father had once trusted this airframe to do what no other machine could. And now it was her turn. At 0712, the first ridgeline of Redstone Canyon came into view. The A-10C held steady at 6,500 feet MSL, just above the rising rock faces. The sun had barely broken the eastern crest, throwing long shadows across the canyon floor. Ellie didn't touch the autopilot. Her left hand worked the trim tabs in small, deliberate clicks. Her right hand kept the throttle firm, steady, and responsive. The aircraft didn't drift. It moved with her. Every control surface felt known. She had reviewed the satellite topo 5 times before wheels up. She knew the geometry. She trusted the thermals would change once the sun began warming the south-facing wall. She adjusted her entry angle 5 degrees to compensate for shear, not because it was written in a manual, but because she'd once seen aluminum twist under similar winds. At 0717, she dropped to 5,900 feet. The rock columns narrowed ahead, and the floor curved into a blind saddle. The A-10's wingspan cleared it by just under 80 feet on each side. She didn't flinch, didn't tighten. She simply rolled 2 degrees to the left to hug the shadow line and reduce. Glare. The canyon held still as if watching. The recon team huddled beneath a rock outcropping near Grid 7B. Their radios were dead, batteries soaked and useless. One of the medics was nursing a dislocated shoulder. Another had lost their boots during the slide and was wrapped in thermal foil. No one expected aircraft support. The terrain didn't allow it. Then they heard it. The sound didn't echo. It pressed downward, a deep, slow hum that moved like a current. They looked up. A silhouette broke through the glare. Low-winged, twin engines. The unmistakable forward posture of an A-10. One of them whispered, That's a Warthog." Another answered without looking away. "Not just a Warthog. That's 820914. I've seen that tail in the training sims." Above them, Ellie adjusted her pitch with 2 fingers and began her descent into the drop. Pass. She skimmed the edge of the southern slope at 200 knots, lowered the airspeed by touch, and lined the manual release with the pre-rigged drop marker she'd mapped by terrain, not GPS. The crate caught the air just right. No bounce. It hit 5 meters from the team. The second followed 7 seconds later. Medical and comms first, then survival gear. She pulled into a smooth, climbing left-hand bank and circled once. She didn't radio. She didn't wave. She simply watched. Below, the recon team tore open the first container, raised a strobe, and gave a single signal burst with an emergency mirror. Ellie saw it, rolled once more at the edge of stall speed, then climbed out. At 0728, she cleared the ridge and rejoined open airspace. 2 F-16s appeared on her upper right. They hadn't been called. They didn't speak. They took escort positions high and wide. She didn't need protection. They knew it, but they came anyway. The return flight was uneventful. Not a word on comms. Not a question from the tower. Just vector confirmation and visual tracking. At 0754, Ellie set down on runway 3. Her touchdown was precise. No bounce. Reverse thrust engaged, but barely needed. She taxied off onto the outer loop without a marshal. The path was clear. Ground crew stood by the bay doors, but no one stepped forward. There were no cameras, no handshakes. The base didn't clap. It never did. Not for this kind of thing. She parked the A-10, killed the engines, and waited for the turbines to wind down, then opened the canopy and stepped out. No one said welcome back. No one had to. They'd seen it in the flight path, in the execution, in the way she brought back silence instead of stories. She didn't fly the return for recognition. She flew it because someone had to, and she knew how. At 0837, Ellie signed her name into the mission ledger in calm, square print. No one watched her do it. No ceremony waited behind the signature line. Just a block, a pen, and the quiet scratch of ink across paper. She slipped her folded checklist card into the back pocket of the log binder. The corners were soft with years of use. The card had belonged to her father. She never changed the notes, just added to them. The debriefing room was cooler than the hangars. Fluorescent lights, plastic chairs. The faint smell of coffee burned too long in a heating tray. 12 young pilots waited in front of the screen. Most wore patches still crisp from issue. One had a boot untied and didn't know it yet. Ellie didn't take the podium. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed loosely, ankle tucked behind the other. The instructor introduced her briefly. No titles, just her name. She nodded once, then looked at the group. She didn't tell them what they'd heard was brave. She didn't talk about sacrifice. She started with numbers, altitude margins, blade tip clearance, terrain funneling, and wind bleed on short burst climbs. She told them to memorize how throttle lag changes under canyon pressure, especially in hotter air. Told them when not to pull up and when to stay in the pocket, even when instinct says bail. She said, "This isn't about flying clean. It's about flying low when no one else can, and making sure what you drop doesn't bounce. They nodded, some writing notes, some just listening. She spoke slowly, not like a teacher, but like someone handing over instructions for something delicate. One mistake from the next pilot meant a different kind of report would be written. She explained how a mission doesn't start when wheels leave the ground. It starts when someone else can't walk out on their own. One cadet raised a hand. He looked young enough to still be checking the checklist twice before each engine start. He asked who flew the pass through Redstone that morning, not because he didn't know, because he wanted to hear her say it. Ellie held his eyes and said, "Tell them it was the Warthog. They'll understand." The room went quiet. She let it settle. Then she finished with this. What matters isn't that you go in. What matters is that you come out slow enough, low enough, and steady enough to bring someone else with you. Even if all you bring back is the chance. She didn't linger. At 09:12, she stepped outside as another class filed in. The sky was clear. Her boots scuffed the same tarmac she'd crossed as a kid, following her father between hangars. Nothing about it looked different now, except maybe the way the air seemed still, as if the base itself had heard her. Ellie walked back toward maintenance. No orders followed. No one called her name. But the flight log still had space, and the plane, resting under a faded sun tarp, was still ready.